here you go. So, could media play a role in a court decision? So, if there's court going on, depending on whatever it might be, actually, one today we're going to talk about a court case. There's a murder. This man was charged for murder. He was seen as a murder in his wife's, well, death. And this court case happened. And because there's a lot of media attention around it, because there's a lot of maybe even misleading stories published by the newspapers and even broadcasting, radio broadcasts, well, this guy got away with it. Maybe we'll see. I'll talk more about it and we can we can judge it, see how this went down. Another one, maybe you can think of OJ Simpson, huh? Maybe media played a role in that. I don't know. Him getting out of the. All right, there you go. So, what do you guys think? Yeah, a little bit longer for you to walk through the door because you're staring at your phone. Yeah. All right, hey, I've got a bell ringer though. Okay. Listen, when we finish up, we can maybe go outside. It looks nice out. So let's get rolling. Those highlight. It's on. We spent too much time outside.
Get like.
Guys, you're gonna really sit back there. Yeah. Everybody can sit in one of these desks. Kicking folders around, moving that desk all around, leaving your chargers on.
What is that?
Right. All right, so what do we think? Just so we can get a rolling here. So could media play a role in a court decision? What do you think? Go ahead, Zara.
You like social media?
Yeah, social media, sure. Yeah.
I said it could because anyone can be influenced by others, such as media opinions, including person reporting. The media could also impact the decision depending on how influential they are. They can skew the views, and petitions to release someone from jail or prison can influence sentences and the opinions of judges and the jury.
Yeah, good job, good job. So depending on what's going on in the world, right? Let's face it, during COVID-19, there's a lot of craziness happening. And when it comes to certain issues, concerns, let's face it, court decisions, they could be skewed depending on the manner of people's opinions or maybe aggression towards a certain topic, right? I don't know, there's a lot of talks, even still this day, about maybe reopening or even looking back at the with the George Floyd murders, just because of the time period and the the time frame of what was happening at the time with the BLM riots and COVID-19. So we'll see where that goes. Again, there's a lot of talks of see where this will lead. Maybe with due process laws of certain concerns of the case. We'll see where it goes. Uh, Anyway, also with OJ Simpson, that gets brought up a lot, right? Let's face it, when it comes to media attention, And how that was one of the biggest stories that come out in the nineties, where many broadcasting companies were following him everywhere he went. You guys remember the white Bronco driving down the street? You guys seen videos, maybe documentaries of it? Yeah, anybody?
No,
No, really? Do you know anything about O.J. Simpson?
no,
Wow, okay.
I live under.
Apparently, there's a Netflix show out with O.J.
We don't check.
Did we see that this morning?
Yeah, it just popped up. Yeah, it popped up. That's what reminded me of it.
Yeah.
Through.
So yeah, when it comes to media's role, guys, please, I might want to move some of you, know. I'm recording too, so you're making me look like a jerk, you know. Online. All right. Anyway, we're gonna talk about a court case today where there is a man that was accused of murdering his wife. And because the media attention was so involved in the court case, and newspapers are obviously writing about it, there's radio broadcasts since the 1950s, so television was still coming around at the time. So there's a lot of involvement of the media, of the press. And it came to a point where he just said, you know what, I can't even think straight, I can't even go home at night, I can't even really discuss the certain matters because there's so much involvement by the media in this court case. So in other words, he said because it wasn't a fair trial, right? He doesn't believe that this was the proper process. He thought that some of the media should have been gagged and that the jurors should have been sequestered, meaning kind of held away from involvement of media sources. Because this is just making it murky and making it not a fair trial. So we'll talk about that later, and that ultimately had a huge impact in the decision of the court case, which, yeah, they should have a fair trial. And if media is too involved, then it gets a little ugly. All right, social media, you brought that up earlier, Yari, good job. That has a big impact now, more than ever, right? Now, when you think about X, when you think about Facebook, TikTok, whatever it might be, right, these stories not just get broadcasted in a local area, but worldwide, right? So we're going to talk about that court case in 1950s. That was more local, and well, you got to imagine the court room was packed every single day, even outside the court. And then obviously with social media, now you got more than just, let's say, 1,000 eyes. Now you got millions and billions of eyes on this case. Does that make sense? And what that could cause afterwards, right? This could cause a huge riot, a huge, really a tearing down of a social fabric of a community or a country, and could have a lot of impacts. All right, so here are your terms for today. Okay, so we got prior restraint, shield laws, sequestered, and gag order. I already talked a little bit about this, but there you go. All right, prior restraint. What is it? What does that mean? Caden. Yeah, good job. So let's say you're a news broadcasting company and you're releasing information about the government, right? In this case, let's just talk about military plans. So this was something that just came out, current events, Yari. Here we go. So there's information that was leaked in a Signal chat, which was like this decoded um, way of communication. And there's a few members of the Trump administration that were talking about plans to attack a terrorist group, the Houthis, and they accidentally tagged a reporter into it. So they're like, uh-oh, someone that's not friendly with them either. And they didn't know about it. So they're having this communication, this conversation about military plans and attacks on this terrorist group, which they didn't give away too much information, but the idea of just knowing that that was happening um, was a concern. So prior restraint, in other words, is how, let's say, the government can prior before the story's release, restrain it. So stop the story from getting out before it's even published, before it's even released. So in other words, it's censorship at a maximum. So in some cases, it's okay. Like let's say it's about national defenses, right? So maybe it's top secret information. Sometimes holding that information is a good thing. But in other cases, if it's really not concerning about national defense or national security, then the press should be able to tell the public and the people what's going on. Does that make sense? So yeah, prior restraint. Good. Shield laws. What do you have for shield laws? Lazar, good. Yeah, good job. Good job. So sources, right? Let's face it. So a lot of times whenever there's a news story that breaks out, right? A lot of times you hear my sources are telling me. You guys ever hear that? Yeah. So these sources are protected by these shield laws in order for people aren't knocking on their doors or coming to visit them and say, hey, how do you get this story? Right? Were you at the scene of the crime? Were you the murderer? Maybe. I don't know. So these shield laws helps protect these people that reveal this information to broadcasting companies and that they can, release it to the public. There's a great movie, and I usually watch it at the end of the year. It's called Nightcrawler. Anybody ever hear of it, see it? Charlotte, you have? Yeah. So Jake Gyllenhaal's in it. Oh, no, okay. Anyway, so with Nightcrawler, it's a movie about this guy that's like on the cutting edge of these stories that release. So he films them all and then he sells them to these channels, like these broadcasting channels, and he makes money off of it. And it gets to a point where he starts to maybe plant, things at the scene of the crime, and even maneuver things for a great image at a scene of a crime that he's at. And it gets a little murky, but it talks about shield laws. So that's maybe something to watch again. It's up to you guys. I think it's a great movie. It's action packed. It actually pertains to what we're talking about here. And I think you'd like it. All right, sequestered. What does sequestered mean? Someone other than Azara. Olivia, what do you got? Okay, all right, good. So yeah, when it comes to a jury in a court case, right? A lot of times you want to try to keep them away from the media, right? The idea, and a lot of times they make it anonymous, right? They don't reveal the names of the jurors in a case. And if let's say you get, placed in jury duty, right? A lot of times when you go, you can't talk about the case at all, right? So some people might know that you're in jury duty, but you can't say anything about it. And there's a lot of cases that happen every single day. So it's one of those things that keeps it disclosed and makes sure that this information doesn't get out to the press, to the obviously the public. And they want to make sure it's a fair trial. That's the whole goal of it, right? So in other words, they want to try to keep these jurors away from the press and just from these stories that get out about the court case, right? I want to try to keep it disclosed so that it's a fair trial. What about a gag order? What is a gag order? What does that mean? All right, Caden, thank you. Yeah, good, good. So again, when it comes to jurors, they can't be discussing it to their friends or family members, right? They can't be broadcasted on social media or telling other people, right? Even media, well, they got to keep it under wraps. Sometimes they even do like a closed courtroom. So you'll see like paintings and drawings of people that, some like artists that detail the courtroom rather than have a bunch of cameras in it or have a bunch of media attention outside the courtroom to make sure that it goes smoothly. A lot of times in these bigger cases, they do that. Right? They even have it in disclosed areas so that there's not a lot of attention there. I'm sure you guys remember the Epstein files, the Epstein list. You guys remember that? No? Okay. So with his wife, right? Or his girlfriend, I don't know, but her name was Ghislaine Maxwell. Right, her case, everybody wanted to know about, everybody wants to know exactly who's involved in this child pedophilia ring. And it got to a point where they had a disclosed area, right, this court hearing. And they only had drawings of inside the courtroom because they wanted to try to keep the media attention away. Some people were saying this is an uproar, this is terrible, what the heck's going on? But in other cases, it's a means to try to protect the people involved that were impacted by it, right? So I don't know, we'll see where that goes. A lot of people are asking for a little bit more information, but we'll see what happens. And then you got ones like Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. You remember that? Holy cow. Some of the stuff we heard from that. Man, but they had that broadcasted everywhere. They wanted to hear all about it. So it just depends. All right, here we go. Let's get to it. Yep, there it is. Okay, so freedom of the press. So, like I mentioned, towards the end of the year, when we get closer to the final, the last chapter testing here, right? I can show that movie Nightcrawler. A lot of kids love it. A lot of people. It's a great movie, and it talks a lot about shield balls, which we'll talk more about. Anyway, when it comes to freedom of the press, what does press and media include? Well, everything, right? I actually haven't had social media to this, right, in most recent years because now people are publishing everything on social media, right? A lot of people just disconnect their TVs, don't even, obviously subscribe to the local newspaper anymore. They just see everything on social media, which what's more instantaneous than that? Nothing, right? These stories break out quick. And a lot of times you determine what to think about the message, what to think about the source, right? In other words, you can compile the sources based off of what events happening, what issues happening, and then you can make sense of it yourself. Rather than, let's say, whatever news broadcasting company that might have an agenda towards it, that might have a twist to it. So now, more than ever, social media is becoming this new wave, right? That, again, our government really still doesn't know how to combat against it. Or I won't say bad against it, but knows how to handle it when it comes to certain information being released. Now we have information at the touch of our finger, right? All around the world within a second. It's kind of strange, right? In other words, I don't know if our brains can even handle it, but we do. Right. One thing to note is that you're seeing a lot of court, even questioning by senators and representatives in Congress to major social media owners like Mark Zuckerberg, right? Before the Twitter files, I'm sure you maybe heard a little bit about that and how information can be even maybe banned, right? How people can find themselves in Facebook jail. What? I don't know, some people do, depending on what language you put out there, I guess. You start to see fact checks, okay? And then you start to see community notes and how people start to look at some information that is reported and say, hey, you know what? Actually, that's not totally true. Here's what this is actually related to. So now more than ever, social media is kind of a whirlwind, right? That's changing how news breaks out every single day. And again, no one really knows how to handle it. But with Elon Musk buying Twitter, making it X, I mean, his whole goal, his whole idea is to try to be a free speech advocate, which some people say they like the platform better now and some don't. That's why you see these new platforms coming out every single day, it seems. All right, so radio and television. So when it comes to the FCC, this is the Federal Communication Commissions, right? And well, they have a lot of say in what is allowed to be broadcasted over the airwaves. Right? Obviously, if you're in your car and you're listening to the radio, depending on what channel you're on, obviously a radio station. Everybody listens to that. Anybody listen to radio anymore? Zara does? Okay, you do too? Really don't. That's sad, actually. But you don't hear any cuss words on there, right? You don't hear anything that is totally mature to a point where kids can't hear it. Right, there might be some, jokes that are put out over the radio broadcast that might be a little more of an adult setting, but typically kids can't pick up on it. Anyway, the FCC has rules and guidelines of what can be said, what can be stated over the radio, even the television, right? So whenever you're watching TV, let's face it, what comes up before, let's say, a mature show comes up? What does it say? You guys know? It shows the rating, and then what does it say usually that follows it? It'll say,
Like PG.
yeah, and it'll say viewer discretion is advised, right? Yeah, you guys ever see it? Okay, so whenever it comes down to it, the FCC has a big part of what is allowed to be stated, what is allowed to be said over certain channels and radio broadcasts. But as you get into the movie theaters, as you get into, let's say, paid, subscriptions, they'll give that rating and say viewer discretion. All right, another thing here I thought was interesting, Turner Broadcasting and FCC, as TV was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? As broadcasting was reaching not just local, regional areas, but all across the country. Well, the government pretty much said that, hey, this is not good, especially for local stations, right? So local broadcasting companies, when it comes to television, when it comes to radio, they still like to reach their consumers, right? And for people, they like to hear that regional base, right, that at-home base, because it's important for them. And at the same time, they kind of fit the understanding of the area a little bit better than someone at a national level. So in other words, this was a fight over local shows and even local broadcasting, local news. And it came to a point where the FCC actually forced Turner Broadcasting, which when you think of NBC and CBS, right? A lot of these broadcasting companies are very big and they have to offer local channels. They have to offer local shows, right? They have to offer local sports and even weather, okay? So in a way, this is making sure that these regional and local companies don't lose their consumers, just don't lose their business. So as again, television has become bigger and bigger, the worry was that they're going to become a monopoly, right? That they're going to just control all means of media that was being directed. That's why even still to this day, I want to watch the Baltimore Orioles, but I can't because I'm not in the local vicinity, right? And I just reached out to the Baltimore Sports Network. Okay, it's actually MASN. And I said, hey, I want to watch the Orioles. And they're like, well, you're local. You should be able to get them. Well, I'm not because I'm way up here in the northern part of Harrisburg area. And I can't get them. I can't get them. So, in other words, I'm locked out for MLB extra innings too. Because they say I'm local, but I'm not local enough. Thanks a lot. So, yeah, it is what it is, right? It is what it is. Echo. All right, so Reno, American Civil Liberties Union. So this is about free speech and what is being stated through media, okay? And in this case, this is the internet. So when you think about what is published on the internet, a lot of things, right? A lot of stuff too. And instantly, as the internet was created, a lot of weirdos were on there posting nudity and sexual content. So when it comes to the internet, it's kind of like the wild, wild west, even social media today. Right, you look at Texas especially, gotta be careful what you search and what you see, because well, a lot of people putting up nudity. Anyway, so for the government, what do they do with that? Well, they want to try to block it. So at first, when the internet was created, they had a lot of code writers in and try to block everything that just showed any type of skin tone. So you can imagine, where you think there's a lot of things that were blocked that shouldn't have been blocked? Yeah, and it caused a problem. To a point where they said, hey, listen, you're blocking everything, right? We can't even post, let's say, artwork anymore without being taken down, right? You think about some old Renaissance artwork. Were they all nude? Pretty much, right? So it was like one of those things that even that was getting blocked and it caused an uproar. Anyway, when it comes to this court ruling, they decided that, hey, you know what, we need to make sure we can protect especially young adults and children, okay, from seeing these types of images online. Right, seeing these types of things on social media networks. Again, this was the nineties, so social media really wasn't around yet then, but, right, you can kind of see the future in a way. All right, then you look at this one here with movies. So in the 1950s, Burstyn versus Wilson, right? This was a court case about a movie that was depicting religion. And in other words, they tried to repeat the whole in the movie. They tried to kind of reenact how how Jesus was born without conception, right? He was just placed within Mary's stomach. Yeah, okay. So in other words, with this film, this was kind of depicting this religious story in a way, and a lot of people were in uproar about it. They said, hey, oh my gosh, they're mocking Christianity. They're mocking this story about how Jesus was born and brought to this world. And they tried to take down the movie. They tried to prevent it from being shown. So in other words, prior restraint, right? And a lot of people kicked back and said, no, you can't do that. This is a form of art. And in the 1950s, especially with this court case, they said, hey, movies actually have more rights than what people want to give it credit for. Because in the early 1900s, they were banning a lot of movies that were being presented. Propaganda films, films about, you got it, communism, that seems to come up quite a bit. But anyway, with this one especially, right, it was more of an ideological movie where it gave more rights for films and directors to embrace storylines that are important. Good. All right, obscenity, Miller versus California. This one's a weird thing here too. So Miller decided to, send out a lot of pamphlets and brochures, and it had a bunch of sexual scenes on it. Pornography, that's what he was sending out. In other words, he was trying to put this out for people to buy these magazines. Kind of weird and strange, I get it. So they said that this was wrong, that this can't be just placed in someone's mailbox. Can you imagine, let's say your grandpa opened up the mailbox and seeing a magazine, oh my God. Or let's say, I don't know, your younger brother or sister opening up the mailbox and seeing this in their hands. You'd have a fit too. So in this case, well, they looked at this and said, hey, you just can't be placing these magazines in people's mailboxes. Because, well, it's a source of revenue, right? This is a way to make money. Right, people like to see it too. Not everybody, right? Calm down. So they decided to actually, they decided, the Supreme Court took it up and they sided with the state of California. They said, hey, in certain local areas, well, this will apply. Maybe some places it's okay, but you got to worry of who's going to pick up this magazine, who within their family might pick this thing up and might be offended by it. So in other words, it's limiting people on what they actually can just put in the mailbox. Let's face it, we all know that's kind of wrong, right? I mean, unless you ask for it, let's say you're buying or purchasing something from one of these stores, then you're fine. But if you just have some random dude just placing this in your mailboxes, that has to be illegal. You just can't do that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right, so again, shield laws, like I mentioned, is a way to try to protect people that are publishing stories, right? Finding this information, okay, and reporting it to news companies. So anyway, like if you're the first person to witness an accident, or let's say a crime, okay, they don't show your face typically. A lot of times they blur it out if you're being interviewed on the television. Or a lot of times too, they just say sources that were at the scene. Right, people that were at the scene rather than actually giving names. Because, well, let's face it, more people are going to want to know about it. So they're going to go to that person's home, find out where they live, and kind of stalk them to hear a little bit more about the story. Let's say it's a murder, right? Let's say that. Right? People are going to want to hear more about it. So, in other words, these shield laws, seriously, you're really, really pissing me off. Okay? Can you deal with things? Can you give me your phone? Put it upside down, treat like a toddler. You like that? I don't think so. Please. All right, next thing, prior restraint. So I already talked about prior restraint. This is how the government can actually prevent the publishing a story or source or information before it's even sent out. So as maybe someone gathering up the sources, the information about something, the government can actually step in and say, nope, we're not gonna allow you to publish this story. Because this is offensive, this might not be accurate, right? Could be fake news. And in other words, in this court case, which is brought up to the Supreme Court too. But near versus Minnesota, there was a journalist that was talking about the mayor of Minnesota, well, one of the mayors of Minnesota, in Minnesota, right, Minneapolis. And he was even talking about the governor of Minnesota and saying about how they were corrupt, how they were misleading a lot of people, how they were taking a lot of money and funneling it into certain areas that they weren't supposed to. So embezzlement, yeah. Anyway, the government stepped in and said, hey, this doesn't look good for our reelection efforts. We're gonna try to stop this from being presented. So the government, these politicians went to the authorities and said, prevent this story from getting out. This is gonna hurt us with our reelection efforts. We can't allow this story to get out. Anyway, they allowed this story to get out because, in other words, the press is supposed to keep the government in check. Right, that's the whole goal of it. Media is supposed to keep government in check. I know sometimes you get state-sponsored media, which in many cases doesn't help. Right, the people understand the full story of things. Other times it might be even propaganda, misleading people in different directions. Anyway, with Near versus Minnesota, this is the way to try to promote people's freedom of speech and allow the press to put out this information, these stories, making sure that the public knows exactly what the government's all about, right? Anyway, if the story is misleading, well, then you can see repercussions. Then let's say someone can sue someone else after the story's already released. All right, and here's a story again on prior restraint. New York Times versus United States, 1971. All right, this just reaffirms Near versus Minnesota, kind of used as precedent here. Anyway, this is known as the Pentagon Papers. So there's a person that leaked information about the United States involvement in the Vietnam War and some of these harsh stories of the government, of the army. And as this information got out, you can imagine the Pentagon is saying, wait a minute, hold up, we can't let these stories get out to the American public. Right? We got a job to do over here in Vietnam. And we all know Vietnam was not a favorable war at all. Probably one that we shouldn't have got in. But I'm not going to say here or there if that's right or not. But anyway, the Pentagon tried to restrain this story from getting out about certain stories that our military was doing over in Vietnam. And the Supreme Court picked it up and said, actually, we're going to side with the New York Times. Right, this information obviously was not handled correctly. And the people should know what the government's doing, right? What the military is doing over in Vietnam. And that's why I see Vietnam being one of the most publicized wars ever, right? There's literally broadcasts on the battlefield, right? As there are bombs exploding all around. This was a way to try to really connect the audience, the people, right? Americans, of what was happening in Vietnam. So again, they call it the Pentagon Papers, this court case. Okay, that's how a lot of people refer to it as. All right, last one, Shepard versus Maxwell. All right, so this was the story I was talking about with this murder. All right, this man was Shepard. He was accused of murdering his wife, and as this information got out, well, the press was all over it. There was news broadcasting, there was journalists at his door, they're all around the courtroom, and as the court was taking place, there's many of these journalists that were writing about the story, talking about it. You can imagine this guy has to go home at it, right? And he's not getting a good night's sleep, let's face it. Right? These journalists, these broadcasters were following everywhere he went, trying to ask him questions as he's leaving the courtroom, which typically you see that in movies and shows, right? You see that all the time. Someone walks out of the courtroom and they're like, hey, what can we get? Dude, what do you think? How it went? Right? And typically you see that quite a bit. But this could really cause harm to someone's ability to have a free and fair trial. So in other words, a jury can be sequestered, meaning keep isolated, right, until the trial ends. Until this is all said and done. It is a way to make sure that it's fair, make sure that there is no issues or concerns with the trial decision. A gag order could be placed too. And this prevents any of the jurors, the media talking about the case. So did he do it? Well, there's not a lot of evidence showing that he actually killed his wife, but the case was just dropped because the media was that involved, right? Because it was going against the Sixth Amendment right when it comes to a fair trial. So in other words, well, we don't really know. So did the guy get away with murder? Maybe, but that just goes to show the influence of media, if it's too much, it can cause a lot of problems. Last thing I want to mention with O.J. Simpson, right? That one's a big story that a lot of people know about. And did the media played a big role in that case? Yeah, big time. Right, this was broadcasted everywhere. Everybody was tuning in, listening about the latest of what was happening here with the O.J. Simpson trial. And it got to a point where many people think that this was not the correct decision, and that was directed in a wrong way, a wrong path, and maybe O.J. Simpson got away with it. Who knows? Anyway, he just passed away not too long ago, so this is what it is. All right, that's it. Is there any questions? Good? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, guys, for paying attention. I appreciate it. Appreciate it. Sorry I didn't get outside.